Welcome back to the channel. This is Richard de Clue, also known as de Lubac. And today I wanted to do a follow-up video on the one I did about a week ago where I criticized Taylor Marshall and Timothy Gordon for an inaccurate portrayal of the thought of Henri de Lubac on the question of nature and grace. And go back and watch that video if you haven't seen it already, because I kind of just give a brief presentation where I show that their understanding of de Lubac was woefully inaccurate, and I stand by it. But I also thought it would be helpful to go back and do a little bit more of an extensive presentation on the thought of Henri de Lubac on this question, so people actually have a better idea of what's going on. You know, de Lubac has been accused of being a modernist in this regard, which is just not the case. De Lubac is a man of the church. He's a man of tradition. And I want to read you a couple of comments that he himself made on why he was doing his work on these matters. Because I think this is very enlightening. De Lubac says, "Without claiming to open up new avenues of thought, I have sought rather, without any antiquarianism, to make known some of the great common areas of Catholic tradition. I wanted to make it loved, to show its ever-present fruitfulness. Such a test called for more for a reading across the centuries than for a critical application to specific points." Basically, what he's saying there is he wanted to comb the breadth of the tradition on this question. He wanted to see what all the various church fathers had to say about it. What does Scripture say about it? What do the scholastics say about it, especially Thomas Aquinas, who was one of his main sources for this, Robert Bellarmine, whom he cites as well. And then he goes on to say that St. Thomas never seemed to me either to make the 12 centuries that preceded him useless, or to condemn his disciples to a failure to see and fully understand what has followed him. And then he goes on, "What I have more than once regretted in highly regarded theologians was less, as others made it out, their lack of openness to the problems and currents of contemporary thought, than their lack of a truly traditional mind. The two things are, moreover, connected," he says. So what does that last part mean? He says, a lot of other people are worried about, they're not open enough to the problems and currents of contemporary thought. De Lubac is explicitly saying that's not his primary concern. His primary concern, and what he laments the most, is their lack of a truly traditional mind. Truly traditional, though. Not false traditionalism, but truly traditional mind. One that actually is embedded in the tradition. It knows the tradition. And that's what he's been worried about, is renowned theologians who don't really know the tradition well enough. Therefore, don't have a traditional mind. And that came up in this question on nature and grace. And again, if you saw my last video, you know I wrote a doctoral seminar paper on the question of divine freedom in the debate on nature and grace, because I think at bottom, really the debate between the neo-Thomists, like Reinhard Hutter, Stephen Long, and Lawrence Feingold, and de Lubac, has to do with their conceptions of divine freedom, because the issue is whether or not God remains free in offering grace. What's interesting is they both say yes. They all agree that God has to freely bestow grace. They don't disagree on that. They disagree on the implications of what one's position means regarding divine freedom. And that's where we come to our issue here. So I'm not going to go into all the details. It wouldn't be possible. De Lubac himself wrote several books and articles on this, just like his detractors have. There is, I do think, if you're interested in a really good overview, in the winter 2008 edition of Communio, which was dedicated to Henri de Lubac's Catholicism at 70 years, There's a great article by Nicholas Healy, and it's Henri de Lubac on Nature and Grace, a note on some recent contributions to the debate, where he brings up Henri de Lubac as well as his detractors. Ironically, this edition of Communio also features an article by yours truly, Primacy and Collegiality in the Works of Joseph Ratzinger. Mine was the only article not about de Lubac in this entire edition, but there it is. That's me. Primacy and Collegiality in the Works of Joseph Ratzinger. 2008 was my first academic publication. Happens to be in the same edition that Nicholas Healy's article is on this question. Just a little nice personal connection. Anyway, so what is actually going on here? All right, so de Lubac studied the Church Fathers and the Scholastics, especially Thomas Aquinas, as well as Lex of Bellarmine, like I said, on this question. Okay. Now, in doing so, he felt that a lot of the later scholastics, especially Denis Carthusian and following him, Cajetan, got it wrong and distorted the authentic tradition. So he wrote his works to combat what he thought was an aberration or a leading astray from the authentic tradition. That's what he was doing. He was trying to bring us back to a more traditional view. And part of the reason was he was worried that their position was opening the pathway towards secularism. Okay, so for all of those people who try to think that de Lubac was a modernist, trying to lead to religious indifferentism and things like that, no. His concern was actually secularism. He felt that their position was actually paving the way for secularism because they were pushing this notion of pure nature to such a degree, and this notion of natural beatitude, that such a radical separation between nature and grace, that grace in some sense isn't necessary for nature to be fulfilled, that you can take it or leave it, which means you're giving too much autonomy to the natural world and to nature, so that man could say, well, we don't really need that, we just need to concern ourselves with fulfilling our nature, and who cares about the supernatural? We don't need it. Oh, it might be nice, but you don't need it, right? That's what he was concerned about. He's like, you're leading to atheistic humanism here. This position is a prefigurement of secularism. And in some ways he was right. He was prophetic. He was saying all this stuff back in the 40s. So he was really concerned about that, and he didn't want that. So far from him being some modernist who was concerned about, updating things or following the society at large or religious indifferentism, far from it. It was the opposite. He was trying to secure the need for divine grace, and specifically Catholicism's understanding of grace through the sacraments and incorporation of the church as the means of salvation that all are called to and need for the fulfillment of their nature. That without that's the goal of humanity, and that's basically the bottom line for him. So he sees de Lubac's position is basically fourfold. One, man only has one final end. There's a lot of proximate ends that can be merely natural, but he only has one final end. His ultimate end is the beatific vision of God, supernatural beatitude. That's it. That's one and only. Secondly, God has inscribed within human nature a desire for the beatific vision. It's what's called the natural desire for the beatific vision. He takes that from Aquinas, as we'll see. Thirdly, the attainment of the beatific vision is beyond the capacity of man's natural powers, and man must therefore rely on God to bestow the grace necessary for the beatific vision. Man can't attain this on his own. He needs grace to attain it. Fourth, God freely bestows the grace necessary for man to attain his end in the beatific vision. Grace is not owed as a matter of justice. It isn't. It's a freely given gift by God. It's part of what grace is by its very nature. Sorry for the pun. So those are de Lubac's 4 main points on this question. I don't think they're that controversial. But there is a tension that some people saw in it, and that's what has been argued over. And we'll get into that later, but let's just kind of go through some of the main parts of this. Right. So, sorry about that. I've just got all these different things I'm trying to pull from at the same time. First of all, he points us to the famous passage from Augustine, the Confessions. You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. Okay, what does that mean? Augustine is saying to God, you have created us for yourself, and we are restless until we rest in you. That is our final end is rest in divine union, resting in God. Aquinas likewise says, the beatitude of any rational creature whatsoever consists in seeing God by his essence. That's from his work on the commentary on the sentences, book 4. He also says, this is Aquinas, one has not attained to one's last end until the natural desire is at rest. Therefore, the knowledge of any intelligible object is not enough for man's happiness, which is his last end, unless he know God also, which knowledge terminates his natural desire as his last end. Therefore, this very knowledge of God is man's last end. That's Aquinas. The knowledge of God is man's final end. And that's from Summa Contra Gentiles. All right, so that is just a couple of those points I wanted to raise, showing that he draws from Aquinas and Augustine. And there's many other quotes. I mean, I gave some in that other article as well, where, well, we'll get into those in a minute on the desire part. So that was just the first part, that that is man's final end. Right, now we're getting into the question of the fact that he has a natural desire for this end, because that's the part that we're struggling with the most here, right? That's what's being debated. And so, in defense of that, he is also going to quote from Aquinas, where he says, again from Summa Contra Gentiles, it was proved above that every intellect desires naturally to see the divine substance. Okay? This is, again, that's Aquinas. Every intellect desires naturally to see the divine substance. So this desire is implanted in man by his very nature. And then in his work, De Malo, Aquinas says, the natural desire of man can in no way be at rest except in God alone. So there is no other final end of man, and there's a natural desire that only finds rest in the knowledge of God. So that's de Lubac's second point. So the first point was that man has one final end. The second is that there's a natural desire for this end, and he's quoted them on that. Now, he's also quoted in many other places. I'm just giving a couple of particularly poignant examples, but to show that he's getting this from the tradition. He's not making this up. It's not from some modernist philosophy. It's from the tradition. It's from Aquinas and Augustine. So it's important that we look at that accurately then. So then the next point he makes is the fact that the attainment of the beatific vision is beyond the capacity of man's natural powers, and man must therefore rely on God to bestow the grace necessary for the beatific vision. That's not really controversial. We know that man cannot attain the beatific vision without God's aid, without grace. No one would dispute that. Okay, so we can kind of leave that mostly to the side. But how does that? Where these neo-Thomists had the problem was they thought that this is the part that they really have a problem with, the neo-Thomists. They don't understand how you can say that man has a desire for a natural beatitude, or a natural end, or has a natural desire for an end that's their only end, and then God not allow it to happen. Or they think that this means God owes it to us, therefore he has to let it happen, otherwise he created us with a desire for an end that we can't attain by our natural powers. And they drew this from a reading of Aristotle. I'll get into that a little bit later. But just to be aware, this is the sticking point for them. But, again, de Lubac is on solid ground here by citing the works of someone like Robert Bellarmine. Robert Bellarmine says in his commentary on the second book of the sentences, that's Lombard sentences, like everyone back in those days, before the Summa became the book that everyone commented on, all of the scholastics were commenting on the sentences of Peter Lombard. In his commentary on the sentences, the second book of the sentences, distinction 25, number 4, Robert Bellarmine says, "It is neither new nor unworthy of the nature of man that he desires naturally what he cannot attain except by supernatural aid." That's Bellarmine. It's neither new nor unworthy of the nature of man that he desires naturally, natural desire, what he cannot attain except by supernatural aid. So according to Bellarmine, this is not a problem. As a matter of fact, even for Aquinas, this was considered to be just part of the loftiness of God's, of man, but of God's liberality. The fact that he was willing to give so much. They didn't see it in the high scholastic period as a problem at all, that man had a final end that he could not fulfill on his own. They did not think that was an issue. That didn't become an issue for people until centuries later. Okay? There are a lot of references to the natural desire for the vision of God in Thomas Aquinas' writings. You see it in the Summa Theologiae, the Prima Pars, the first part, question 12, article 1. You see it in the Prima Secundae, that's the first part of the second part, question 3, article 8. You see it in Summa Contra Gentiles 3, chapter 25, and chapters 48 to 54. Also in his Compendium of Theology 1, chapter 104. The gratuity of the supernatural order was not disputed back then. That wasn't an issue. Everyone knew that it was a gratuitous gift. So anyway, where's the problem then? So far, we see that de Lubac has made all of his 4 points. Where's the issue? Well, it really starts with Denis the Carthusian, who died in 1471, so 15th century. And he had this idea that human nature, he thought that the idea that human nature desiring an ultimate end that is beyond human nature's innate ability to obtain was in conflict with Aristotle. So there was a certain reading of Aristotle that natural desire cannot extend beyond natural capacity. So that there's a link between natural capacity and natural desires, that desires come from the capacity. So without the capacity, there is no desire. And that's where a lot of the neo-Thomists take off. But again, that didn't come in until the 15th century. We're talking almost 200 years after Aquinas' death. He died in, I think it was 1274. Denis the Carthusian died in 1471. All right, so almost 200 years later. And it's important to note that Denis was arguing against the teaching of Thomas Aquinas. So his argument was against Aquinas, that human beings have a natural desire for the vision of God. Now, it was about 40 years or so later, according to Nicholas Healy in his tracking of the time, with the Dominican theologian Cajetan, who's one of the major commentators along with Suarez. But Cajetan, who lived from 1469 to 1534, so now we're getting in the 16th century, he accepted the same premise that Denis had articulated, okay? But, as I'm quoting from Healy here, instead of arguing against Aquinas, he offered a new novel interpretation of the latter's teaching on the natural desire. So he says, oh, well, Aquinas didn't really mean it. When Aquinas says natural desire, he only means a natural desire that was elicited because God had offered grace. It's not really a natural desire. De Lubac doesn't buy it. Okay, neither do I. So basically, this notion of there being a problem with having a natural desire for the beatific vision didn't come about until the 16th century, and mostly because of citing Aristotle, not Aquinas. So, I think it's a very important thing to consider here. For both Augustine and Aquinas, for whom the natural desire for an ultimate end beyond nature was a sign of God's liberality and the nobility of intellectual natures. Read from the De Veritate. In the very beginning of creation, human nature was ordained to beatitude, not as to an end proper to man by reason of his nature, but given him solely by divine liberality. Therefore, there is no need for the principles of nature to have sufficient power to achieve that end without the aid of special gifts with which God in his generosity supplements them. So again, they didn't see a problem with it. Okay, yes, there's nothing wrong with the fact that God has to supply the power to attain the supernatural beatitude to man. It's not a problem. It's still what God willed in creation. Okay. Nevertheless, because of the 16th century, 15th and 16th century commentators on Aquinas, who then later were followed in the manualist tradition, a lot of the manuals, students of theology and seminarians were reading the manuals and the commentators, but not Aquinas himself. And that's what de Lubac had an issue with, which is why he constantly went back to Aquinas himself on these questions. So, what ends up happening is, in this later development, the Neo-Thomists start postulating this notion of pure nature, that God could have created a natural world with man, human nature, to whom he did not offer supernatural beatitude, and therefore would have just a natural end. Think of like limbo. Okay, this notion that you could have a creature that's perfectly happy just in the fulfillment of its natural capacities and doesn't need the beatific vision of God, doesn't even necessarily want it, doesn't really even know about it. It's just natural capacity. Now, both sides agree on the obediential potency question, that man by nature has the potential of obeying grace once it's offered and given. It's built into nature, that it's compatible with the offer of grace. But in these neo-Thomist positions, they basically say until the offer is made, there's really no desire at all for it, except as maybe a velleity. Oh, a velleity is a desire for something that is not attainable, and therefore it's not frustrative. Like, oh, it'd be really cool if I could go fly around the moon and then come back, without the use of rockets or anything. Well, that'd be cool. It'd be nice if it were possible, but it's not possible, so I'm not frustrated in my nature. So yeah, so it's like a somewhat of a desire, but not a desire that needs to be fulfilled for my nature to be fulfilled and complete and perfected. That's kind of the notion of velleity. But de Lubac doesn't really like this. He thinks that this is starting to lead towards secularism. It's giving nature too much of a free rein and too much of a self-determined or self-enclosed goal that he doesn't think really exists for man. And this is what he's worried. He's worried about secularism and atheistic humanism, which he also wrote about, okay? Because he was concerned about it. He doesn't like the notion that, at least in this world, that we can push this idea of there being a natural finality, an ultimate end of nature, qua nature, without supernatural beatitude. At least not for man, okay? That's where he has this issue, because he thinks then you're basically giving the secular world license to say, well, then we don't need the supernatural. All we care about is the natural. And you can't fault me for it. If my nature can be fulfilled without supernatural grace, then I don't need supernatural grace. I just need natural beatitude. That's all I need. And we can create a world that meets man's utopian desires on earth in that natural end. And we don't need the divine. Oh yeah, it might be nice. Technically, it might be better than nature, but we don't need it. It's extrinsic. It's something super added to nature, and therefore not part of the fulfillment of the nature per se. That's what de Lubac thought was problematic, and he would not have it. He thought it was way too dangerous to be holding that position. He also thought it was non-authentic to the tradition. He firmly believes that we, in fact, were created for the beatific vision and for no other reason. So Fergus Kerr, the Dominican theologian, summarizes it this way. Aquinas subscribed to the teaching of the Fathers, of the undivided church, that means both East and West, namely, that the human creature desires by nature a fulfillment which can only come supernaturally as a gift by sheer divine grace. Okay? Now, what about this notion of pure nature and the hypothetical scenario of that Humani Generis even talks about? There are some who destroy the gratuity of grace, it says, right? Others destroy the gratuity of the supernatural order, since God, they say, cannot create intellectual beings without ordering and calling them to the beatific vision. That's the line that people thought was against de Lubac. Destroying the gratuity of the supernatural order, since God, they say, cannot create intellectual beings without ordering and calling them to the beatific vision. But as we've already seen, that's not de Lubac's position. He affirms the gratuity of grace and flat out says God does not owe this. God does not owe us the grace to attain our final beatitude. And he basically critiques this neo-Thomist idea of a hypothetical scenario as being inefficient, or insufficient, I should say. It doesn't accomplish what it thinks it's trying to accomplish. It's unnecessary. As a matter of fact, it's dubious with regards to securing the grace. What do we mean by that? So, this idea of pure nature is often associated with the hypothetical possibility that God could have created a world along with intellectual beings, like humans, without ordering and calling them to the beatific vision. That is to say, God could have created man with no supernatural finality. De Lubac doesn't deny that, which is what Humani Generis was arguing against, was people who did deny that, saying that, well, he has to order and call them to supernatural beatitude. He says, no, I'm not disputing that God could do that. He could, but that's not what he did. And that's all de Lubac cares about. He doesn't care about some hypothetical situation that doesn't actually exist. So anyway, he affirms that God could have created man without calling him to supernatural beatitude, and thus the real possibility of the proposed hypothetical man in the hypothetical purely natural world. Hypothetically, yes, it's possible. So he doesn't deny the truth of that statement. He just thinks it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't matter. And it doesn't secure what we actually are looking for, which is securing the freedom of God to offer grace. So he disputes, first of all, the sufficiency of the hypothetical world for securing divine freedom's offer of grace in this world. Okay, so in the world that God has actually created, the desire for God is written in the human heart, because man is created by God and for God, and God never ceases to draw man to himself, which, by the way, that comes from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, number 27. All right? So anyone can readily affirm that God's right to not offer grace in that hypothetical situation. Yet, as de Lubac says, ultimately all that interests us is what exists in fact, in reality of the reality of our nature as it is, acting at this moment in God's creation as it is. That's the question. Is God free to give his grace in this world, not in some hypothetical world? And he thinks that that's the true task of the theologian. I'm going to read this long quote because I think it's worthwhile. I do not say that it is false, but I do say that it is insufficient. For it completely fails to show, as some people think, and as by logic of the theory it should, that I could have had another, more humble, wholly natural destiny. It only demonstrates, presuming it to be well-founded, that in another universe a being other than myself, with a nature similar to mine, could have been given this humbler destiny. But I repeat, what has this other being really to do with me? What have I to do with him? My destiny is something ontological. See, this is metaphysics here. My destiny is something ontological and not something I can change as anything else changes its destination. We must therefore seek along some other path for a more real certainty of the gratuitousness we need to find. Saying some hypothetical example does not secure divine freedom and offering grace in this world. And some creature in some world that doesn't exist, that is not called to supernatural beatitude, has nothing to do with me or you or any other human being that's ever existed. Okay, because we have been called to beatitude in the beatific vision, and that's what matters. So if we need to secure God's freedom in offering that grace, it's got to be in this world, not in some other world. And it also raises the question of the final and formal cause relation, even going back to Aristotle and Aquinas. Can you change something's final end without changing its essence, its nature? That's the tough one. You're saying you're going to change the final cause of a creature. So you can have a rational animal in some other hypothetical world that has a different final end. Is it the same species? I mean, there's ways of arguing that it is, and there's ways of arguing that it's not. But how do you change the final end, the telos of something without changing its very nature? Because typically in metaphysics, we see those two things as linked. So anyway, so he just thinks it doesn't do anything for us. It's insufficient. You can say, yes, truly he could do that, but it doesn't accomplish anything. So it's insufficient. But it's also unnecessary. Divine freedom does not need a hypothetical scenario to guard itself from the actual state of affairs. Okay. there's no need to postulate the idea of pure nature in this world to secure divine freedom. Essentially, the core of de Lubac's claim that pure nature is unnecessary for securing divine freedom lies in his rejection of the principle that led to its assertion in the first place. This is what I argue in my paper that I really should have published as an article, but I didn't get a chance to. That the real debate between the likes of the Neo-Thomists of our day and de Lubac is on the nature of divine freedom. That's why my paper was titled Divine Freedom and the Debate Over Nature and Grace. Because I think in order to prove one way or the other that whether de Lubac's right or wrong, whether the Neo-Scholastics or Neo-Thomists are right or wrong, you have to first come to a notion of divine freedom and what it entails and what it doesn't entail. And this is where I think the rubber hits the road. What can circumscribe God's freedom? What can limit his freedom? And that's the question. Basically, he thinks, de Lubac denies that if God endows man with a natural desire for the beatific vision, that somehow he owes it to man to bring it to fulfillment. He writes, nothing limits the sovereign independence of God who gives himself. No demand from any order can be imposed upon him. Okay? So God's ultimate freedom, basically, is not, he doesn't owe us anything. He doesn't owe a hypothetical creature anything, and he doesn't owe us anything. And so this, again, so he's not destroying, as Humanitarius was concerned with, people who were destroying the gratuitousness of grace. Well, it only destroys the gratuitousness of grace if you argue that God has to bestow something. Well, he doesn't. And he doesn't think it's enough to say that, oh, well, just the initial offer is free, and then after that, as we'll see, de Lubac's concern is that if you're trying to make it sound like the initial offer of grace is free, are you then saying that subsequently, now that he has made the offer and it's given us this desire for it, that he must now bring it to fulfillment? So it was only initially free, but now he's obliged? And de Lubac doesn't really like that answer. Is there any justification, he says, for formulating a hypothesis by whose terms God must in justice assure man of any beatitude, however natural? De Lubac doesn't think so. God remains free to offer grace or not, even now. One might even argue that for eternity, that in heaven it's still a free gift he's giving, and not something that's owed. We can talk about meritoriousness and stuff, and I think that would be the next step to go to, is how to go understand merit. But if the argument is that grace has to be free to be grace, well, doesn't that apply to the saints in heaven? Are the saints in heaven enjoying God's free gift of himself, or is he just obliged to do it? I don't just mean by his promises, but is he obliged because they want it? Or is it a continual relationship of freedom in heaven? I think the latter, and that's what de Lubac's position is. We can't make it sound like God owes this to the saints. De Lubac thinks this is precisely the understanding of divine freedom and the offer of grace that we must have. Otherwise, one ends up saying that because God has called us, whether it's through innate natural desire or through a superadded call, it doesn't make any difference here. That you end up saying that he must fulfill it, or at least give us the grace sufficient to fulfill it. In which case, de Lubac contends one has actually destroyed divine freedom in the here and now. And he doesn't want to do that. And that leads to the third major critique of the Neo-Thomistic approach. The premise they cling to, and from which they draw the necessity of the concept of pure nature and the appeal to a hypothetical universe, actually calls into question divine freedom's offer of grace in this world. De Lubac thinks this is unacceptable. So not only is this postulation of the hypothetical pure nature, is it insufficient and unnecessary, it's actually calls into question God's freedom when offering grace here. And that's the problem. De Lubac much prefers the insight of St. Irenaeus. Again, going back to the Church Fathers. St. Irenaeus proclaims, God shows himself to men when he wishes, to those he wishes, as he wishes. We do not understand his thought at all unless we apply it immediately to these men that we are today, to all the men of this world, and first of all to our first father, that is Adam. In other words, the true problem, if there is one, is posed for the being whose finality is already supernatural, since such is our case. In other words, whether you hold his position that there's a natural desire, or that it's only due to the offer of grace that lifts us up to have this desire, in either case, the question has to do with God's freedom of giving grace to those whose finality is already supernatural, which is our case. So that's basically an overview, and I apologize, I know it was a little bit disjointed. It's late, it's almost 1 a.m. I have to work another long day tomorrow. But I wanted to get this out there because I think there's just way too much poor misconceptions out there and false presentations of his thought. And that's why I wanted to do this. So once again, de Lubac's concern was to secure the tradition of the fathers and St. Thomas himself against more modern developments that came in the 15th and 16th centuries through Denis the Carthusian, who argued against Aquinas, and then Cajetan, who tried to make Denis's arguments work by reinterpreting Aquinas. That was his concern. And then this was being passed on and on and on in seminaries and universities, and he wanted to stop it. So he wanted to go back to the authentic tradition here and say that man was created for the beatific vision. There is no other end that can satisfy man in this world. That is the one and only goal of human nature, and that it requires divine grace because we can't attain this through our nature. We do not have by nature the power to attain that. But nevertheless, God does not owe it to us to give the grace necessary to attain it. It's still free. That's de Lubac's position, and it's Catholic. Do I think you have the right to hold with Feingold and Hooter and Stephen Long and Cajetan if you want? Yes. It's a theological dispute. It's not a matter of heresy or not. I do think de Lubac's position, though, is the more Catholic, the more authentically traditional, and is the one that I would subscribe to. And it took me a long time to get there. I mean, I studied this stuff for a while before I came to that conclusion because I understood the questions on the other side. But in the end, I think de Lubac's right. He's right on the interpretation of Aquinas. He's right on what the true, authentic Catholic tradition was, East and West, and in the scholastics themselves. And that's it. I think there's a great argument to be made, and I'd welcome a discussion on that. What I don't welcome, and that I can't agree with, is throwing de Lubac under the bus, misrepresenting him, calling him a modernist, and all this stuff. That's nonsense. Calling him un-Catholic. It's just not true. So I hope that helps people have a better understanding of de Lubac, what he actually thought, what he actually taught, and why, and what his concerns were. He wanted to avoid secularism. We should probably want to do that too. And I think he makes a good argument for that. And even more importantly, he presents the real thought of Aquinas on the matter. And I think we should be grateful. Cheers.